Hi, my name is Ryan Scott. My dad, Dan Scott, passed away a couple days ago on Tuesday, July 28th, 2020. And was thinking about my dad a lot, and I had some memories and some things I'd like to share about my dad with you. So I'll warn you, I've never done a video like this before. I'm not exactly sure how it's going to turn out, so I'll apologize up front. But the goal really is for um, anybody that knew my dad or loved my dad, or even people that knew him pretty well. I'd like to give kind of a full view of who Dan Scott was. And part of the reason why I was inspired by this was I went to a funeral a couple of years ago, and the funeral was like 2.5 hours long, and there were like musical breaks and five speakers and six speakers and everything like this, and they were talking about the person that passed away, like. And listening to all these people talk, it was like this guy was like the 13th disciple or something like that. And that was not my experience with that gentleman at all. I didn't like that guy at all. So I thought, you know what? Whenever somebody that I love passes away, I would really love to share stories about who they actually are. And so I wrote down some notes. Some stories to tell. So, and I'll warn you that there are no segues of any kind in this video. So it's going to be a whole bunch of stuff, and don't say, and that reminds me of, or whatever. So it's just going to be a bunch of random thoughts and memories. So I think to understand my dad the best would be to understand the story of Tom Sawyer whitewashing a fence. And so if you're not familiar with the story, Tom Sawyer got in trouble for whatever reason, and his punishment was to go outside and to paint a fence white. And Tom was a particularly cunning and smart young man. And so what he did was he started painting just a little bit, and as friends came by, Tom would convince the friends about how much fun it was to whitewash the fence, and that the friends should actually pay Tom for the opportunity to whitewash the fence because it's just so much fun. And so by the end of the story, as people kept walking by, not only did Tom not paint the fence, but he also had all the neighborhood kids not only doing the work, but paying him for the privilege of doing the work because he was so convincing that whitewashing the fence was so much fun. That's my dad. My dad is Tom Sawyer in that. And if you've ever worked with my dad, you'll know that he was always volunteering to be out front, always volunteering to be in charge of something. But when it came time for the actual work to be done, it was somebody else doing the work. It was not Dad actually doing the work. And he was getting praised for allowing people to help him do his work. So if you don't take anything else if you've never met my dad, just imagine a grown-up Tom Sawyer. My middle name is Virgil, and part of the reason why my middle name is Virgil is because my parents found out that they were pregnant with me on the year anniversary of my grandfather dying. So I never got a chance to meet my granddaddy Virgil, but everything I ever heard about the man, I really think I would have liked him a lot, and I really would have appreciated and enjoyed being around him. I cannot say the same for my grandmother. My dad's mother was the worst kind of horrible, and I'm sorry, Uncle Halbert, if you're watching this. But anybody else, any of my cousins or anybody else from my side of the family knows that my grandmother was just absolutely the worst. And I found out from my Aunt Joyce whenever my dad and I went to visit Aunt Joyce in Tennessee one time, that my grandparents were not really churchgoers or strong Christians, but my Aunt Joyce was dating and then married a man named Charles Williamson, who was a preacher, and Charles Williamson affected my grandparents so greatly that they started going to church. And so and my Aunt Joyce is 13 years older than my dad. So whenever they started going to church, both my dad and my Uncle Hal were brought up in the church, and they were both baptized and saved at an early age. So the legacy of my Uncle Charles and his devotion to the Lord actually gave eternal life to my Uncle Halbert and to my dad, Dan Scott. He was also the baby of the family. I hope you understand that. So his like I said, his older sister was 13 years older than him. He has a brother that's a couple years older than him, and my dad was the baby of the family. And everything he did was right and good and wonderful, and he very rarely got in trouble. And so he grew up with a significant amount of charm and self-confidence, because that's how he was able to get away with absolutely everything. My dad grew up loving to play baseball. When he got older, with churches, with people from church, he would play softball as well. And so a lot of people have memories of my dad either playing baseball or softball. And Dad was always the pitcher. He was either the pitcher or the catcher. He always wanted to have the ball in his hand because he wanted to control the flow of the game. I hope he was a good teammate. Maybe some of you who actually played sports with him, you could either comment or reach out to me telling me if he was as good a teammate as he thought he was, but he thought he was a fabulous teammate. And another thing about my dad is he grew up in a little town in Tennessee called Trezevant, and he was Mr. THS, Mr. Trezevant High School, and that was one of the things he told my mother on one of their first dates to try to impress her, to say that he was Mr. THS. And my mom said, "What is THS?" And he said, "Well, it's Trezevant High School, of course." Of course, Trezevant was a small town in Tennessee, only of a couple hundred people, but he was quite proud of him being Mr. THS. My dad had really, really pretty and deep blue eyes. That was one of the things that was the most striking about him. If you ever got up close to him and saw that he had really, really pretty, really, really deep eyes. And they were kind eyes. I think some people have unkind eyes. My dad always had kind eyes. And my dad was always charming, always smiling, always starting conversations with people around him, strangers, people on airplanes, people in lines. My dad was just a social guy, and he found ways to connect to people, even if he didn't know them, even if they were in social situations. My dad also loved Jesus, and he was baptized, like I said, at an early age, again, thanks to the influence of my Uncle Charles, who was passed on, and my Aunt Joyce, who was passed on. But he was baptized, and he loved Jesus Christ. Like I said, no segues. I'm sorry, I'm jumping between all these memories of my dad. But he was in the life insurance business for many years, and often, even as a 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old kid, I would during the summers or during breaks, I would put on my little suit. I'd put on my little suit, and I'd go to work with my dad. Because whenever I went to work with him, I knew what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, because I thought to myself, well, I could drink coffee and I could eat donuts and I could ask people about their kids. And at the end of the conversation, they hand me a sizable check, and I get to have a good life after that. And so even though I didn't do life and health insurance, I followed my dad into the insurance business. And that's where I still am, 44 years old, and I have no plans to do anything else for the rest of my life, and so that was an influence of Dad with me. One of the people that my dad worked with when I was young was a guy named Phil Knibe, and I hope Phil somehow you're able to watch this. Whenever my dad worked with Phil, this was in the very, very early days of email, and so what would happen, according to Dad's story, was that people were able to write emails inter-office. This is like 1982, 1983-ish. So they're able to send these emails, but you couldn't tell who the email actually came from. and you could print out whatever the memo email and put it in somebody's inbox. And so my dad figured out that he could screw with Phil, and because Phil was a big hunter and fisherman. And so Dad, on some Friday afternoons sometimes, would print out emails and make it look as though it was coming from the guy who ran the office about how everybody had to come in over the weekend and do some work. And so Phil would get these fake memos and we'd just furious. And in fact, I think Dad even got Phil to show up on a couple Saturdays before my dad, like months or years later, finally admitted to writing the fake memos, and Phil would get upset with him. But even though he messed with Phil, Dad was always talking about Jesus. And on a business trip with that same Phil Knibe, they were staying at a hotel together on a business trip, and Dad was talking to him about Jesus. And Phil heard the story of Jesus. He believed in Jesus. He repented of his sin. He confessed his belief in Jesus. And Dad took him out to the hotel swimming pool and baptized Phil. So even though he screwed with people, he also pointed them towards Jesus all the time. My dad was relentlessly positive. He very rarely had a bad day. And any obstacle or anything that he had to overcome, like I said, since he grew up with so much confidence, he was confident that he could overcome it, which made my dad a really fantastic encourager. And so if anybody was struggling with something, you would want to talk to my dad, because he'd be the attaboy, and you can do it, and don't be scared, and we can get through this together. I think that was one of my dad's best qualities, and that's something that I hope, as his son, I hope to emulate that for the rest of my life, is that if anybody gets anything from me, it can be an encouragement. We even made the joke, now that he's passed away, that Dad was going to be buried with his thumb up, or we were going to put a little sign around his thumb saying, come back in 5 minutes, I'll be fine. And I half jokingly say that because over the past 8.5 years, my dad has coded or died countless times, and he always came back. He always came back from him, except for this last one, of course. Can only do that so many times, but he did that, I am not joking, 20 times, 30 times, whenever there was no hope for recovery, no nerve activity, no brain activity, no anything. And he came back. My dad was 5'6", but he thought he was 6'6". He never had the little man or Napoleon syndrome. He just assumed he was a big dude. He was a big, tall dude. And in fact, if you ever got into a vehicle with him, or you drove the vehicle that he was driving, you'd get in and you'd be surprised that the seat was pushed almost all the way back. And it seemed like it would be impossible for a guy who was 5'6" to drive anything with the seat all the way back. And so finally I said, Dad, how do you even reach the pedals? And he said, I drive tall. I've been blessed with a lot of good friends. A lot of good friends who are watching this video. And one of my best friends is a guy named Justin Brown. My dad actually did Justin and his wife's wedding many years ago. And this was before Justin and Leslie got married. But Justin, my mom and dad were visiting me at college, and Justin was there at wherever we were. And my dad very sincerely looked into Justin's eyes, and he said, you are very, very important to us, and we'll always love you very much, Jason. And his name was Justin, of course, and Justin very nicely said, well, Don, or some variation of Dad's name, you're very important. You're very important to me as well. Also, when I was talking about my friend Justin, it reminded me of a story. So, Dad had a large, huge 12 gauge shotgun that he was showing off to Justin one time. And so he pulled that thing out and he was showing it to Justin. And Justin looked at it, and the gun, the shotgun itself was literally about 3/4 of my dad's height. It was huge. And Justin said, "Dan, you've never fired that in your life. It would knock you right on your ass." And Dad cocked it and just said, "I'm ready for him." We didn't find out who he was ready for. I have no idea what he was preparing for. And to my knowledge, he never did shoot that shotgun because it would have knocked him right on his ass. That's absolutely true. A memory that a lot of people will have of my dad is his leading singing. He loved the lead singing at church. He loved the lead singing before a cappella concerts. Even when singing was not scheduled, my dad would love the lead singing. And I have a couple stories that I wanted to tell you really briefly about his leading singing. So it was before an a cappella concert, and it was a packed house. It was sold out. And so my dad decided, because my dad was always in front, always the MC, always in the spotlight, my dad decided that he was going to lead some congregational singing for people who were unprepared for congregational singing. So he grabbed the microphone, he put the spotlight on himself, and he went out, and he decided to sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. And so he starts out so strong. He said, "Hey, let's sing a song." And mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. And my dad moves a lot, or always moved, walked up and down aisles and stuff like that whenever he was leading singing. And my dad forgot the lyrics of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. So it sounded like, "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is stomping out the grunches." And then he finally recovered and came back with it. But so Mom and Celeste and I were all rolling, and for years we would remind him about how he was stomping out the grunchins. And I'm trying not to get emotional when I'm saying this, but I think the song that my dad probably knew the best, and the song that I'll always remember him leading at church, was a song called "I'll Fly Away." And my dad flew away, new body, etc., etc. And so, whenever people sing extremely loud, they would, they say sing from your diaphragm or sing from your stomach. My dad would sing the song "I'll Fly Away" from his ankles. He would sing. There's a part where the chorus would swell, and I'm not even going to attempt it because I can't sound like my dad, but he would scream, "I'll fly away," and it was really, really pretty. He always sang that song with so much confidence. I love the Denver Broncos. Whenever our family moved to Colorado when I was young, I fell in love with football. Just at the beginning, I fell in love with the Denver Broncos, and especially my very favorite player ever, John Elway. My dad really wasn't into football very much before that, but he got into football because I was into football. That's one of the things I love about my dad. But some of the stories and some of the memories that I have of my dad are revolve around football. Ever since I was 7, 8, 9 years old, my dad and I would do the same routine of 10 up top, 10 down low, right hand, left hand. Anytime the Broncos scored a touchdown, 10 up top, 10 down low, right hand, left hand. Every time they scored. Even when I was not with my dad and the Broncos scored, I found myself doing that motion to put up my hands because my dad was always there to smack my hands after a touchdown. One of the blessings is that from the time I was 10, right up until he got sick, we went to at least one Broncos game a year. We would make the trip. We'd have our own little church service before the game, and then go watch the Broncos. And then we'd both be hoarse because we'd be screaming so much, waiting to get out of the parking lot and reflecting on the game. I'm sad that I'm never going to be able to do that with my dad again. We also went to Greeley, Colorado, whenever the Broncos had their training camp there. And one of my favorite memories about my dad with that was, number one, he got probably 40 autographs of players. He was in the right place at the right time. We had a little program. He had people signing papers on the way off, and he got to talk to Mike Shanahan. This was in 1995, so it was Mike Shanahan's first year as the Broncos coach. I was not able to get close to John Elway. I really wanted John Elway's signature on my hat. I wasn't able to get close enough. But one thing we discovered in 1995 was we were watching the Broncos practice. So you could hear all the interactions with the coaches and players. And Dad kept pointing to one guy. He said, "Who's that number 30? Who is that? Pull out your program." And I looked at it and I said, "Well, some kid named Terrell Davis, who just came out of Georgia, like a late round pick, and he's like fifth or sixth string running back." And Dad said, "Watch this kid run. Nobody can tackle him. People just bounce off of him." And sure enough, when I'm watching it in Greeley, it's like every time that kid touched the ball, people try to tackle him and bounce off it. And I told Dad, I said, "Well, we either have a really, really terrible defense, or that kid is a really, really special running back." And of course, it ended up being both. The Broncos did have terrible defenses for many years, and Terrell Davis now is in the Hall of Fame. But my dad was the one who first noticed him with me at Greeley, in Greeley. My dad was also with me whenever my little dream did come true. That same trip that I mentioned earlier, that we were in Tennessee visiting with my Aunt Joyce, we went to a Broncos game that was in Tennessee. And we were both huge Tim Tebow fans. It was at the beginning of Tebow Mania, so I got to meet Tebow's agent, his brother, his dad, his mom was not there. I got to actually shake Tim Tebow's hand, which was really cool. But since I had field passes, I was actually on the field, and before the kickoff, they started to shuttle off everybody that was not supposed to be on the field, and I got to walk off the field right next to John Elway. And so I'm shoulder to shoulder with John Elway, and I turn and look at him, and I say, "I know you probably hear this with everybody." I said, "But you've been my hero since I was a kid, and I don't want anything from you. I don't want you to sign anything. I just want to shake your hand and say thank you." And John Elway shook my hand, popped me on the shoulder, and smiled and said thanks. And then, even though the Broncos lost that game, we had a terrible team that year. I was beaming all day long. And who's the first person that you think I told when I got right back up to our seats? I said, "Dad, I just met John Elway." I just shook John Elway's hand. And even though it didn't happen to Dad, he was so happy for me because he saw me struggling to get close enough to John Elway, who was getting mobbed in Greeley, 20 years prior. And he was able to celebrate that with me. That was a really special memory. My dad can't tell a joke to save his life. He would always start the joke, he'd screw it up, he'd start laughing in the middle of it, and then he'd mess up the punchline, and then he'd wonder why you weren't laughing. But I will tell you two of my dad's favorite jokes. No, I'll tell you one. I don't want this to be too long. There was a man who got in a wreck and was on a deserted island for many, many years, until finally he was rescued, and the rescuers came and they landed on his island. And they were there to pick him up and rescue him, and they saw that he had 3 structures on the island. And the rescuer said, "Hey, what's that? What's that first little building over there?" And the guy said, "Well, that's my house." And the rescuer said, "Well, what's that second building over there?" And he said, "Well, that's my church." And he said, "Okay, well, what's that third building over there?" He said, "Oh, that's where I used to go to church."